Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. Now usually on this show we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks on a $25 budget, but today we have an episode of Quests for Quarters. On episodes like these I'm going to take you through underrated budget cards that you should be considering when you build your decks. For these episodes, not only does every card have to be under $1, but they also have to be used in less than 4,000 decks on EDH Rec. And as always, prices on this show are powered by our sponsor, TCG Player. Before we get started today though, make sure you go check out our new classic pink playmat and Commander's Quarters t-shirts on thecommandersquarters.com. And thank you to everyone who's already purchased our merchandise, it really does help support the channel. Also, make sure that you subscribe to the channel and click that little bell notification icon so that you can stay up to date in the latest Commander's Quarters episodes. Our first underrated Quest for Quarters card is Rapid Vigor. Currently, it's only 22 cents and is seeing play in less than 1,000 decks. It's an instant for just 1 and a green that says regenerate each creature you control. This is a fantastic, cheap and efficient protection spell for your entire team. In general, green likes to get out a lot of big, impactful creatures out onto the battlefield, so usually a board wipe can set those decks back pretty far. It's important to protect your position and to stay ahead of your opponents with a card like this. Now this card might not protect your team from every single board wipe, but it does protect you from most. Another card with the same effect is Gauri Charm, which currently is 16 cents and is seeing play in 6,600 decks. It does have a more restrictive casting cost, but it also has some modes that you can choose from. Its other modes are to give all creatures -1/-1 until end of turn, or to destroy target enchantment. This flexibility definitely increases its use, but it also shows how powerful that regeneration can be. When someone wipes the board and you can save your entire team for just 2 mana, you're going to be way ahead of everyone else. And then there's a similar card that's starting to get a lot more play recently, which is Heroic Intervention. It's an instant that costs the exact same, and it says permanents you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Now this card is just strictly better than Rapid Vigor. Not only is indestructibility better than regeneration, but on top of that it gives hexproof. Also, whereas Rapid Vigor only protects your creatures, Heroic Intervention protects all your permanents. Now this doesn't mean that Rapid Vigor isn't a good card. Heroic Intervention is an excellent card, and Rapid Vigor is a great budget alternative. And there are plenty of decks that wouldn't mind running both of them. Now Rapid Vigor shouldn't be seeing as much play as Heroic Intervention, but it should be a lot closer. There is absolutely no reason for this budget card to be under 1,000 decks. There aren't too many of these board wipe protection spells in green, so you're going to take what you can get. A similar card that's very powerful in certain decks is Inspiring Call. Currently it costs 19 cents and is in 6,300 decks. It's an instant for 2 and a green that says draw a card for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Those creatures gain indestructible until end of turn. So while this costs 1 more mana, it does provide some extra utility. This card is extremely useful, but only in a very specific kind of deck, whereas Rapid Vigor can be useful in pretty much any green deck that revolves around creatures. Finally, let's take a look at Dauntless Escort, which comes in at $1.30 and is seen in 4,600 decks. It's a 3/3 that costs 1 green white, and it says sacrifice it, creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. Now this effect comes on a body which has advantages and disadvantages, but it still illustrates that decks want to find every way that they can to protect their creatures. Mono green decks especially have very limited access to these kinds of effects. While Rapid Vigor might not be as impactful as these other cards, it still should have its place among them, and in my opinion it should be seeing a lot more play than it currently is. But now it's time to go on to our second Quest for Quarters card with Reigns of Power. Reigns of Power is currently seeing play in 3,800 decks and is 49 cents. It's an instant that costs 2 blue, and it says untap all creatures you control and all creatures target opponent controls. You and that opponent each gain control of all creatures the other controls until end of turn. Those creatures gain haste until end of turn. This card is extremely flexible and is one of my personal favorite cards to play. This card can be used in a wide variety of circumstances, either offensively or defensively. If an opponent's attacking you and you don't want to block with your own creatures, just gain control of someone else's. Not only does this protect your own position, but it can set 2 of your opponents back. I also can't tell you just how many games I've won just from casting this card. Essentially at a certain point in the game, this card can become a mini Insurrection. If you don't have a strong board state but one of your opponents does, you can just gain control of their creatures and swing out with them. Killing one of my opponents with their own creatures is one of my favorite things to do in Magic. This card is so powerful that it can even help you get around Cyclonic Rift. When one of your opponents overloads Cyclonic Rift, you just take their creatures and swap them with yours. So effectively that opponent bounces their own creatures and yours stay on the board. There are a ton of applications where this card is great and even game winning. There aren't too many similar cards to this, but let's take a look at some. Perhaps the most comparable card is actually not a very good one. Twist Allegiance is currently 26 cents and is seeing play in 244 decks. It's a sorcery that costs 6 and a red, and it essentially does the exact same thing. It should be pretty obvious, but the reason that Reigns of Power is much better is because it's an instant and because it costs 3 less. Twist Allegiance may only deserve to be in 244 decks, but Reigns of Power definitely deserves to be in a lot more than it is. Now let's look at a card that I mentioned before, which is somewhat comparable with Insurrection. Insurrection is currently $7.63 and is seeing play in 8,600 decks. It's a sorcery that costs 5 red, and it says untap all creatures and gain control of them until end of turn. They gain haste until end of turn. Now this card is both better and worse in a few ways. It's only a sorcery and it does cost 4 more, but you do get to gain control of all creatures and you don't lose your own. While this is a fantastic finisher, it's not really as flexible as Reigns of Power is. Since it costs 8 mana and it's only a sorcery, you really have to commit to it. Reigns of Power costs a lot less mana, can still win you the game, and is very flexible in when you can use it. In my opinion, Reigns of Power should be seeing play in a lot more decks than Insurrection. If you want to see a deck where Reigns of Power really shines, check out my Feldergriff deck. Another somewhat comparable card to Reigns of Power is Domineering Will. Currently it's $3.13 and is seeing play in 1,600 decks. It has the same converted mana cost and it says target player gains control of up to 3 target non-attacking creatures until end of turn. Untap those creatures they block this turn if able. This card used to be one of my budget favorites, but it actually went up in price recently. Unlike Reigns of Power, this is pretty much strictly a defensive card. While it does allow you to pick and choose those creatures, you only get 3 of them. Reigns of Power can be much more impactful by getting you someone's entire army. And finally, there's Mob Rule, which I showcased in a previous episode of Quest for Quarters. Currently, it's 27 cents and sees play in 2,900 decks. It's a sorcery that costs 4 red and essentially lets you gain control of all creatures with power 4 or greater or 3 or less. This is a fantastic finisher, but like Insurrection, it's not as flexible as Reigns of Power. If you haven't tried out Reigns of Power, I highly recommend using it in one of your decks. You'll be surprised at the number of situations that it comes in useful and makes a huge impact on the game. And now let's move on to our third Quest for Quarters card today with Slaughter the Strong. Currently it's 56 cents and is seeing play in 1,200 decks. It's a sorcery that costs 1 white and it says each player chooses any number of creatures they control total power of 4 or less, then sacrifices all other creatures they control. This card is an incredibly efficient and powerful wrath for just 3 mana. It works great in decks that have small creatures or just don't care about creatures at all. It also works great in a deck like Joda or Feather where you only need 1 creature on the board and they have a power of 4 or less. Now your opponents do get to choose what creatures they keep, but again they're limited based on their power. For the most part, they only get to keep 1 or 2 creatures, and usually it's not their best ones. The best part about this card is that it doesn't destroy creatures, it makes them sacrifice them. So this can even deal with any pesky, indestructible creatures. If your deck is built for it, this can be pretty much a one-sided board wipe for 3 mana. This is a fantastic card, and it should be seeing play in a lot more than 1,200 decks. A somewhat similar card is Retribution of the Meek. It's an older card that is currently $10.84, and it's seeing play in 1,800 decks. It's also a very efficient board wipe as a sorcery for 3 mana. It says, destroy all creatures with power 4 or greater that can't be regenerated. Now this is a good card in its own right, but in my opinion, it's still not as impactful. While this can get rid of a lot of big creatures, it still can leave a ton of small creatures on the board. Against a go-wide strategy like a token deck, this can basically have no impact, whereas Slaughter the Strong still can. And while it can deal with regenerating creatures, it doesn't deal with ones that are indestructible. In my opinion, Slaughter the Strong should be seeing play in a lot more decks, and it's a lot more budget-friendly too. Another somewhat comparable card is Fell the Mighty, which comes in at $5.68 and is seeing play in 4,300 decks. It's a sorcery that costs 4 and a white, and it says destroy all creatures with power greater than target creature's power. Now this card does cost 2 more mana, but it is a little more flexible. It essentially allows you to pick and choose what power level you want to destroy. Now this can be great for certain decks, but I still think Slaughter the Strong is more impactful. Fell the Mighty doesn't deal with regenerating creatures or with indestructible ones, and there are going to be plenty of times when you don't have the perfect power level to choose. It's definitely a good card in the right deck, but I still prefer Slaughter the Strong. Another wrath that forces sacrifice is Tragic Arrogance. It comes in at 45 cents and is seeing play in 4,100 decks. It's also a sorcery that costs 5 mana, and it says for each player you choose from among the permanents that player controls an artifact, a creature, an enchantment, and a planeswalker. Then each player sacrifices all of their non-land permanents they control. Tragic Arrogance is another fantastic budget wrath. It can be better in certain situations, but worse in others. It deals with more than just creatures, but it's also going to make you lose more too. It also guarantees that each opponent only gets to keep their worst creature. But there are times when Slaughter the Strong can get rid of all of your opponent's creatures. Regardless, both are fantastic wraths and should be seeing a lot more play. A final comparison that we can make is to a one-sided board wipe with Garrix Wyk. Currently it's $1.65 and it's seeing play in 13,000 decks. It's a sorcery that costs 7 black and it says destroy all creatures you don't control and all planeswalkers you don't control. Now this is a one-sided board wipe, but it's also 9 mana. It does deal with planeswalkers, but it doesn't deal with creatures that regenerate or are indestructible. There are definitely decks in which Garrix Wyk is just better, but if your deck is built to take advantage of Slaughter the Strong, it can be much more impactful for you. And at just 3 mana instead of 9, it's a much better deal. But now let's move on to our final Quest for Quarters card with Voyager Staff. Currently it's only 14 cents and is seeing play in just over 700 decks. It's an artifact that costs 1 and it says pay 2, sacrifice Voyager Staff, exile target creature. Return the exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. This is an extremely flexible card that can be used in a wide variety of circumstances. The majority of decks out there want cheap and efficient ways to protect their commander. Voyager Staff can pretty much protect your commander from anything, including a board wipe. It can also be used defensively since you can use it to target one of your opponent's creatures too. But where I find it most useful is in decks that really want to abuse enter the battlefield effects. Colors like blue and white have a lot of access to blink and flicker effects, but other colors don't. A simple card like Cloud Shift is currently 15 cents and is seeing play in 3,500 decks. It's an instant for a white that says exile target creature you control, then return that card to the battlefield under your control. Enter the battlefield effects can be very powerful, and this is a fantastic way to abuse them. Now these effects are well represented in blue and white, but we need some more artifact options. A somewhat similar artifact is Cold Storage, which is currently $4.32 and sees play in 259 decks. It costs 4 and allows you to pay 3 to exile target creature you control, and then you can sacrifice Cold Storage to return each creature card exiled with Cold Storage to the battlefield under your control. Now this can be better in some ways, but it's much worse in others. This card actually used to be budget, and I was using it in a few decks. Even though this card might not seem that great, this type of effect is really rare outside of blue and white. A much more commonly played artifact that abuses enter the battlefield effects is Conjurer's Closet. Currently it comes in at $3.36 and it's being played in over 12,000 decks. It costs 5 and it says at the beginning of your end step you may exile target creature you control and then return that card to the battlefield under your control. Now unlike Voyager Staff, this is not a one-shot effect. Every single turn you get to abuse that enter the battlefield effect that you want to. But it's also not as flexible as Voyager Staff since it can't protect any of your creatures. I'm not saying that Voyager Staff should see more play than Conjurer's Closet, but should definitely see more play than it is. And finally, just to show how powerful abusing enter the battlefield effects can be, let's go on to Deadeye Navigator. Currently it's $3.55 and sees play in over 19,000 decks. It has Soul Bond, and as long as it's paired with another creature, each of those creatures has pay 1 in a blue, exile this creature, then return to the battlefield under your control. Now this card has a heavy investment, but it can be abused multiple times. Deadeye Navigator is a fantastic card, but it can only be used in decks that have blue. Voyager Staff may be a one-shot effect, but it can be used in any deck. I think Voyager Staff is highly underrated and should be seeing play in a lot more decks. There are plenty of red, green, and black decks that want to abuse enter the battlefield effects as well, and this helps them do that. And with that, this show is coming to a close, but I really just want to hear about what you guys think about this episode, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. When you're buying a deck or just individual cards, make sure to use our link in the description. Not only will you be getting great prices on TCG Player, but you're also going to be supporting this show because they sponsor us. And make sure that you follow us on social media so you can get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel. And while you're at it, check out some of our other episodes on budget deck techs, Quest for Quarters episodes, Commander topics, and Creators Quarters. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.